This is an instructional video on how to make a very simple graph in the program Logger Pro. I'm using a Mac version of the program, but these instructions should be relevant for any platform. If you're using the Logger Pro for PC, everything should be basically the same. Some of the details of the presentation will be different depending on the details of the data you're graphing. I'm going to be graphing data relevant to an experiment about friction, but regardless, the process is going to be exactly the same. To start off, we're going to change the heading on the top of the column, the two columns in this data set. To do that, just double click at the very top of the column. Here it says X. I'm going to double click there to edit the column. I'm going to change this to the name of my particular data column, which would be normal force in this experiment about friction. The short name is just an abbreviation for the full name. Often it could be just a letter, or maybe a letter with a some sort of amendment. You can actually do Greek letters here, which are common in science, or a subscript or a superscript. For example, to the second part, that's not actually what I want, but just to show you that that's there. The units of this force are going to be newtons, but you might include units of centimeters or grams or whatever. When we click done, you'll notice that this has changed here. I'm going to do the same thing to this other column. We'll call this the friction force, and I'll give it a name F sub F, and this is also going to be in units of newtons. Let me just go ahead and enter my data here so we have something to work with. 3.0, 1.6, 4.2, 2.7, 10.1, 5.2, 15.8. Now you'll notice Logger Pro is smart enough to make a graph of, in this case, friction force against normal force as I enter those values, which is quite convenient. This isn't exactly the graph that we want. In most cases, we don't actually want these points to be connected by lines. For example, you'll see if I just enter, just to give you some, if I enter a made-up point here, it'll connect those 2 points from my last point to the next one. And even worse, if I enter a point that's down, say, over here, it'll connect it wherever in sequence. Often we just don't want this at all. The connecting points is the problem, so we want to turn that off. In order to turn that off and just display the individual points as we've typed them into the data columns, you're going to want to double click anywhere on this graph field. We can, at this point, give the graph a title. I'm going to call mine, say, dragging sandpaper against wood. And we can turn off this connect points feature. You're almost always going to want to do that for a graph in science class. You're also going to want to turn on these point protectors. You'll see what they are in a second, but if you look down here in this corner where Logger Pro has graphed these data, when I click done, you'll see that I've removed the lines between the points and I've added these circles around these points. These circles are what are known as point protectors. You'll notice I can also change the color. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, if I want to change the color of the friction force here, I have to double click at the top of my column. I can change this in the options of that column. I can change the color to, say, something much cooler than red, like violet. I can also change the style of point protectors that I'm using. If you feel like it, you can make it, say, I don't know, something really exciting, like a filled triangle. you'll notice that that changes the color and the point protectors associated with my points. I'm actually going to turn this into something empty so I can see the points in the center of the point protector. Oh, excuse me. Dragging. Now, I've got a problem here in that all my data points are kind of shoved down in this corner here. I'd really like to expand the scale of the graph, in this case, so that it doesn't show friction values from 0 to 100. And so instead it's showing only values from, say, 0 to 20 or 0 to 16. High enough that a large enough range that I get to see all my values that I've recorded, or in this case, since that's the friction axis, it would be maybe 0 to 10, but not so big that it shoves everything down into the bottom. There are a couple ways to do this. One of them is if you hold the cursor against the axis, you'll see the cursor change into this little squiggly arrow. You can actually use this to stretch the axis one way or another. This is somewhat limiting, as you'll see. I can't really stretch it all that far upwards. It's really good for squishing things down, but I can't stretch as far upwards as I'd like. But that is one way of changing the scale of the graph. You can, depending on where you... oh, never mind. Alright, so another way to change the scale of the graph is using this button right here. It's called the auto scale feature. And if you press it, like I'm going to do right now, you'll notice that Logger Pro automatically changes the scale of the two axes to display exactly as much, or exactly the range that it needs to show all the data that you've recorded here. For example, if I include another point like this, then the auto scale will automatically adjust to include this point here, which you can see. It's kind of shoved up in the corner here. Sometimes this auto scale is good enough, but often it's not. Let's get back to this. In this case, for example, I would really like to include my 0, 0 point that I would like to see on my graph, where friction equals 0 and normal force equals 0. In this case, the scale of the graph isn't extended low enough in either of those cases for me to see that. The way of changing the axes of the graph that I think is most effective and most versatile is by, again, double-clicking anywhere on this field of the graph. And if you click on Axes Options, you'll be able to change these values directly. For example, on my vertical axis, which is graphing friction force, I'm going to include values from 0 to 10. My highest value is 8.5, so I definitely want something above that, but I'm going to choose a nice round number of 10. I can do the same thing down here. I want to include 0, and in this case, maybe I'll go up to 20. I can choose whatever I want. But the point is I can be very specific about it. And if I do this, I get the 0, 0 point that I want, and I also don't squish anything into one specific region of the screen. So once we've done that, we have a nice graph here. I've got one last step that I want to show you, which is fitting a straight line to the data that you've recorded. I want to warn you before we do this step that this is not always appropriate to your data. It's very, very important before you do this next step that you think about whether it's appropriate. In this case, my data look fairly linear. That is, it looks like I could draw a straight line and go basically through each of the points. That is, it looks like if I continued the relationship out to greater values of normal force, say 30 or 40 newtons, that the friction force would increase as well. In this case, it looks appropriate to fit a straight line to these data. However, This will not always be the case, so I don't want you to think that it's just one last step to do on your graph, because it may not be appropriate to do at all. However, if you make the decision that it is an appropriate step with your particular set of data, all you have to do is click this button up here that says linear fit. It's got a squiggly line with a straight red line. If you click that, Logger Pro will calculate a straight line that is as close as possible to all the points. This is something that you could do roughly with a ruler, but Logger Pro does a better job, and it does a more precise job. This is important because you'll notice it gives you information about the line that is fit to your data in this case, slope-intercept form, that is y equals mx plus b, where m has a number associated with it, a coefficient, and b has a number associated with it. In this case, the number associated with the slope is given as 0.5175 newtons per newtons. That is, depending on what units you include over here, your slope will be given units as well. And often that slope will have physical meaning. In this case, the relationship between the friction force and the normal force is called the coefficient of friction, but the meaning of the slope will be different depending on what data you're graphing. You'll notice you also get a y-intercept from this, which is sometimes useful information. You also get a number that's called the correlation. This number is fairly close to 1 in this case, which is fantastic. If all the points fit perfectly on a line, then this number would be 1.00. But depending on the data that you enter, whatever you measured in your activity, in your lab experiment, this correlation might be further away from 1. That's not necessarily a problem, but it is information that might be relevant to you. All right, I've got some other videos as well about doing more complicated things in Logger Pro. Logger Pro is a pretty powerful program, but this video and these steps are all you really need to make a very simple graph, whether or not it has a linear fit. Thanks.